Hello and welcome to the Bishara Magazine podcast. I'm Nikos Yangu, podcast editor for the magazine, and I'm joined today by my fellow editor, Peter Hewitson. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Nick.
Today we interview Cynthia Bourgeault, Episcopal priest, writer, and internationally known retreat leader who has been described as a modern-day mystic. Her life work has been the recovery of the Christian contemplative and wisdom paths, very much influenced by the recovery of the Gnostic Gospels. She has also been influenced by people like Gurdjieff, Teilhard de Chardin, Jean Gebser, and Ken Wilber's integral approach, who see human consciousness as constantly developing. She has authored numerous books, including Eye of the Heart, The Wisdom of Jesus, and The Meaning of Mary Magdalene. Her latest is on the 20th century contemplative Thomas Keating, whose practice of meditation and centering prayer she closely follows. Her works and words have sparked controversies and many debates, and with her latest blog, she shows no sign of slowing down. Hi, Cynthia. Hello, how are you?
Oh, we're just fine. Thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us today. The great contribution, or one of the great contributions you've made, is this focus on contemplative Christianity, and particularly the practice of prayer as a vehicle of transformation to realize our full humanity. So if it's okay with you, we'll like to make that the focus of our interview to start with.
Certainly.
Great. All right, well, let's jump in. So you say that the contemplative tradition in Christianity, which was largely lost around the 3rd to 4th centuries, and now been revived in the 20th thanks to the groundbreaking work by Christian contemplatives such as Thomas Merton, Thomas Keating, and others. And you've added your own ideas to the stream that you call the wisdom tradition, which you say has always been native to Christianity, and which is now being recovered thanks in no small part to the discovery of the Gnostic Gospels. So could we start out by having you explain what was lost and what is different about this new breakthrough understanding of Christianity?
Well, I think what was lost was really the insight that that Jesus was a teacher and a catalyst of the transformation of consciousness in his era, and this is really the best sort of buttonhole to pigeon in, and if you're going to do one, and that what he was passionately interested in was pointing out to people how they were sort of caught in the hall of mirrors that's characteristic of the state of consciousness that human beings sort of normally live at, and to introduce something that has a variety of different names. It's the fashion is to call it non-dual consciousness nowadays, borrowing from the Eastern religions, where I think it means something a little bit different. But it's definitely, some of the people call it integral consciousness, a term first coined by Jean Gebser, the Swiss philosopher, to suggest that something kicks in that gives people a deeper depth in consciousness that lets them escape from the sort of limitations of the operating system of the mind. And so people first experience Jesus as a person who woke them up. And this is what comes through the gospel. And what also comes through the gospel is the strong sense that this capacity for awakening and the jolt to the state is present even vicariously in the teachings without the person there. So for the early Christians, Jesus was the master of a transformation of consciousness. This is by definition a wisdom teacher, and I think what the Gospel of Thomas in particular does is to accentuate this. The use of the term Gnostic Gospels, I myself am not totally comfortable with, because it's sort of a retrojection and a slightly pejorative term which was first applied out of a wrong sort of sense of them, that these were later Gospels that represented a falling away from the original teaching. And it only looked like that because the original teaching was already ossified in the wrong direction at the time that they were discovered. So the Gospel of Thomas is a straight up collection of wisdom transformational sayings, and it overlaps with the material in the Gospels that everybody's familiar with, but it puts an entirely different spin on them. That he's not teaching nice little moral lessons or things, but that he's really straight out to collapse the structures that trap us in our manners of thinking and our rut traps of thinking, and introduce us to what you might call direct three-centered perception. Uh, so the Gospel of Thomas just makes this really, really clear. And the others are a mixed bag, and some of them are really sort of, you know, fanciful and superstitious and dramatic and heavily over allegorized. They're not all at a level, but the Gospel of Thomas is a real keeper, and there are a few others that radically change the picture. So you ask what was lost, and I think that what was really the consensus of some of the finest teachers, and Elaine Pagels summed it up, but many have seen this, that Christianity, probably in the wake of it becoming catapulted to the state religion in the early 4th century, became a religion about Jesus rather than a religion of Jesus. And it was about worshiping this wildly unique person, and then all sorts of theological, uh, you know, hyperbole was laid on him. That he was begotten, made, born before the years. And all of this is true in one level, but you need another tool to get that right. But what it did was to emphasize to people the gap between themselves and Jesus, and say we have to worship him because he was this extraordinary guru that came. And by the way, the way you worship him is to believe the right things about him. So Christianity became packaged in creeds. This will again take place in the 4th century. Institutional hierarchy proliferated to ensure and sort of safeguard doctrinal orthodoxy. So with that, the original fresh hermetic approach, the original practices of Christianity were really wisdom schools. People in the early deserts, trying to reconnect with this transformational barakah of Jesus, and to clear their decks and do the work. So that was what was lost. And of course, once things start to get heavy, they get heavier and heavier and heavier. So what happened in this modern day revision, which you can put the name Thomas Burton on it because it's a very familiar name, and he certainly had a catalytic role in this in the 60s, that naming that what Christianity had in these intervening 1,500 years come to call contemplation, and sort of pictured it as a rarefied gift that could be given to only very humble spirits only at the end of their life, carefully metered by the monasteries that held the franchise on it. When that Thomas Burton blew all that out of the water and said, no, this is the basic ground of a prayer that gets out of your mind and gets out of your transactional, relationships with a God that's perceived to be out there, and actually allows you to go directly deeper into the ground of what is and always is, the ground of belonging from which you're springing. So in the 70s, grassroots movements began to grow up in Christianity that essentially took the resurgence of meditation that was happening all over the planet at that point, driven by the Asian traditions, and simply used it to jumpstart Christianity's own hidden and eclipsed tradition. The realization that what the early desert teachers in Christianity were talking about was most closely approximated by what we nowadays call meditation. And so practices began to develop that would allow Christians to do that within a Christian context. so that you didn't have to jump ship and become a Buddhist or a or a Hindu, or God love them, a Sufi. You could if you wanted, but you didn't have to. That there was the reclamation that this was an indigenous gift of the human uh, uh, species to affirm and claim and grow from our inevitable and unbreakable personal direct connection with bands of intimate understanding higher than our minds.
You've already alluded to the next question about Jesus being a wisdom teacher
Mm-hmm.
in the tradition of great wisdom teachers whose
Mm-hmm.
primary concern was the transformation of human consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So, in this way of understanding, the kingdom of heaven is transformed to a state of perception available now,
Mm-hmm.
not as a future afterlife reward.
Mm-hmm.
Can you say a bit more about Jesus' teachings on kenosis, this Greek word which means, I think, self-emptying?
Yeah, yeah.
And how so, and what changes when we shift at a deeper personal interior level, when we move from a belief-centric institutional approach to a way of direct knowing that is heart-based?
Yeah. Well, the the ways of looking at that don't lie easily within the grasp of mainstream theological language. You have to move around into the languages that have been preserved in I think most helpfully nowadays, in the language of conscious evolution, to allow you to see what happens. What happens is that, back when I was going to seminary, they gave you only two options. Was Jesus a priest or was Jesus a prophet? And theologians like to bat back and forth. Well, it was almost like a kind of theological racquetball, and good cases could be made. But the wisdom model was not on anybody's plate, because people at that time were not thinking that consciousness was something that transformed. It could be purified, it could be redeemed, but it couldn't be transformed. There was no sense that we were riding on a moving carpet. Uh, and that it was moving somewhere. It wasn't until the early 20th century, uh, with one singular exception in the Western tradition, uh, that I'll talk about if the conversation goes that way. But it wasn't until the early 20th century that we really began to get maps that allowed us to see that, yeah, that there is another state of consciousness that more closely resembles direct perception and instantaneous compassion and conscience. And all these things come because you are directly perceiving from oneness. And that doesn't mean not particular, but it means that you see the light shining through the bits and pieces, and you perceive from that, and your actions reflect that. And that more and more of that consciousness, once it was named and identified, people could begin to go back and look at the mystical traditions with fresh eyes and say, oh, so that's what they were talking about. They weren't talking about wandering around in the fields and having happy experiences with God. They were talking about a kind of direct perception of reality that occurred at, the easiest way to say it is a higher bandwidth on the ray of consciousness, a higher coherence, density, integration. And so that changed things. So what does kenosis have to do with that? Kenosis has to do with self-emptying. And the word comes directly from a liturgical poem or chant by St. Paul describing the mind of Christ. And interestingly, Paul says in this, you should have in yourselves the same mind that was seen in Christ. And then he goes on to describe it. Though his state was that of God, his being Jesus Christ, yet he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to, but rather he emptied himself, and assuming the state of a slave, was born in human likeness. Well, the word that Paul used in Greek, the language he was speaking in, for emptied himself was kenosis, self-emptying. So that's how the term got into the language. And traditionally in Christianity, it was assumed to be the emptying of self-will. not my will, O Lord, be done, but thine. The purging of what they called sinful self-will. And the construction was very much that human beings, probably because of the little uh, peccadillo in the Garden of Paradise back at the beginning of creation, had sinned, had disobeyed God, were driven out of the kingdom, were evil, and were subject to sinful self-will, which meant disobeying God. So that was a thing. So self-emptying was always interpreted as a moral act of self-purification, self-renunciation, and soon fostered a very complex industry of spiritual directors trying to help sort you out what was your will and what was God's will. And and you can see that the whole thing only makes sense within a completely theistic dualistic separation where God is out there, God has a will, I have a will, and they tend to go opposite because human beings are evil or tainted with sin. So you have to knuckle under. And then that way kenosis equated to surrender and knuckling under. Uh, and it wasn't until the 20th century on the maps of consciousness that people really began to see, you know what happens is that the problem is not the self-will. It's the whole model of the autonomous selfhood that we look at the world through. Because as long as we're our brain is set up so that we put our interior on the inside and everything else in the world on the outside. And so when I say I love God, God becomes an object. As long as we're doing that, we're going to get caught in that simple self-will gives up is simply the renunciation of my choice in a matter about whether to go left or go right, without realizing that what's really being asked is to give up that very restrictive sense of consciousness. Uh, and uh, and all the baggage that goes with it. Because when you have that, you get to have a story, you get to have a preferences, you get to have like and dislike, you get to have uh, a strong sense that the future is pulling you somewhere. You get all these perks that allow you to sustain yourself in a completely self-generated story that you're a discrete discrete, a separate individual with a personal history, with what soon became a soul, which was assumed to be a sort of imperishable bit of gold DNA, which is yours and yours only, and that you got at the moment of your conception and birth. Uh, so, uh, so the whole story went to reifying things, and within that, of course, the renunciation of your own will. Uh, is as far as you can get. But under the in a transformational map, which really includes what you might call a witnessing or a higher selfhood, a real selfhood, uh, that's beyond this, you realize that what's being asked is to get out of the squirrel cage of your self-constructed story. I remember one story that made a huge, it was a moment of revelation to me. Uh, when I was in the midst of a personal struggle, and I knew that I was trying to let go of a person in my life that I knew was damaging and not right. And I found this very, very difficult, basically because I'd heaped so much story on it already, that this was, Tristan and Isolde, this was, uh, and, and all of a sudden there was a day that something went ping, and whatever is my inner helper says, why don't you try letting go at the subject pole rather than the object pole? So that rather than letting go of this object and renouncing it and surrendering it in obedience to this God that had another plan for me, what I did is just let go of the self-making system that was justifying itself by creating the story and the wants and likes. Uh, and I could not believe how simple that was, how absolutely effortless and easy. Just step out from behind, like in the the great iconic American show, The Wizard of Oz, the little guy in the box who's saying, I am the great and terrible Oz. Step out from behind the great and terrible Oz. Take a deep breath. Look at reality as it hits you with fresh air on your face and say, okay, I exist. So kenosis in a transformational mechanism is really, for me, the bridge between the embattled, identified narrative self that we take ourselves to be, and the gateway into what will grow through witnessing presence, stable witnessing presence, into the words differ for it in different languages. A Keshan self, a higher self is the Gurdjieffian language, true self, real I, uh, but something that is qualitatively different in its perceptual field. And when you perceive things differently, your will follows accordingly.
Can we move on to talk a little bit about centering prayer as the vehicle for enabling this transformation?
Hmm.
I mean, as you say in your writings, it goes back to the Desert Fathers as well as the the medieval book, The Cloud of Unknowing.
Yep.
And as you've already said, Christianity has this deep non-dual current within it.
Yeah.
And that centering prayer was then developed by Thomas Keating in the 1980s as helping to enable this sort of transformation. Can you say something about this practice and what's unique about it and how it impacts the practitioners?
Yep. Well, centering prayer grew to be a very, very, uh, you know, unique and sophisticated, I think, subtle form of entering meditation. It's back in the 70s, when meditation methods were getting started in Christianity, two methods showed up in very quick order. One being something called Christian meditation, which was founded by a Benedictine monk, which was classic, straight up mantra meditation, very, very similar to what you receive as gateway training in Eastern practices. You sit down, you say a mantra, for them, Maranatha, come Lord Jesus, and you keep your attention tethered in it for the whole time, so that your thoughts don't dare to wander because they've got that ground. And if they start wandering, the mantra pulls them back. Centering prayer sort of started out with that, sorta. But what what the person who actually developed it, who was again a monk, who was one of the monks in Thomas Keating's monastery, went to for his reference point, was this 14th century Christian spiritual classic, The Cloud of Unknowing. And this is a very, very interesting vehicle. When you talk about this deep non-dual strain in Christianity, this is your exhibit A. And in this 14th century uh, treatise written by an unknown British monk, probably a Carthusian, uh, in a language which was only beginning to be written down, Middle English in the 14th century. This is Chaucer. This is really raw. Uh, and what he's describing there is the earliest known map that I've found in the Western Christianity of what would later become, under the hands of people like Jean Gebser and Ken Wilber, the structures and levels of consciousness. And what he recognizes very, very clearly is that centering it is that what Christianity was calling contemplation is not a state of prayer so much as a structure of consciousness that permits direct perception of the divine. And so his way of getting this, the author of The Cloud, was, he says, that there's a whole bandwidth of prayer which he calls lower contemplative and higher active, which is very much focused around developing your relationship with yourself that you've generated narratively, the self we've just talked about. And that contemplation goes through breaking that feedback loop of letting go of the constant whirling of contemplation or of stories and how am I feeling and introspection and practices that reinforce the illusion of a separate phenomenal self. So this was the background he was writing out of, and Thomas Keating somehow or another picked that up in his teachings. My own monastic teacher, who took the practice of centering prayer and really put it on the map as a grassroots movement. And what he did was to get the basic kenotic flavor of the cloud of unknowing thing. So Thomas posed it as, rather than giving yourself a mantra to steady yourself so your thoughts don't wander, uh, recognize your thoughts are going to wander in meditation, because it's the nature of the mind, the default mechanism of the brain, as we now call it, to be constantly sort of spewing out these thoughts. And he says, okay, so use them. Every time you find yourself thinking, you're engaged with the thought, you let it go. You don't cling to it. You don't hang on to it and take it in and say, "Oh, I've got to stop the prayer because I've now got a good piece of insight about myself." He says, "Let it go. Let it go." So you practice over and over and over again in centering prayer this kenotic motion, moving yourself from this clinging, though his state was that of the God, he did not deem equality with God something he should cling to letting go, thought by thought. And another word for letting go is surrendering your thoughts. So in centering prayer, what happens if you come in and your mind is busy and overstimulated and you're working with a problem and your headaches and everything is, and you're not in a good state to do meditation? Hallelujah, you've got a lot of raw material, because as all this comes up, one person in an early retreat said to Thomas Tizzy, "Oh, Father Thomas, I'm such a failure at this prayer. In 20 minutes of sitting here, I've had 10,000 thoughts." And Thomas says, "How lovely, 10,000 opportunities to return to God." So what he's doing is positioning this gesture of letting go as a pathway of returning to God. So surrender becomes the pathway of returning to God. That's how it's spun theologically. When you get yourself under an fMRI and look what happens to the brain when that happens, you are carving a track in the brain that will associate with the surrender, with this opening, this moving into a larger and more direct state, with the letting go of this attachment. So the prayer is interesting because it works at the level, I believe, of subtle kinesthetic transformation. It's actually working with rewiring the neural pathways. And of course, there's a huge attitude involved here, because we're doing this in solidarity with Christ. And I point out to people every time they manage to let go of even a single thought during the prayer, that they're participating in the mystery of Christ, the Paschal mystery of Christ, and deepening their capacity to actually act in solidarity with the kenotic mind of Christ. So that helps people a lot who've come to think that meditation means being very, very quiet and not having any thoughts and being peaceful or blissful. That centering prayer says, no, that's not what meditation means. Meditation means imprinting in yourself deeply as your default response to any situation, the situation of, rather than embracing and defending and hanging on to me, to go in with openness. What's here? How? And it happens before you can think about it and agree to it, because it's being imprinted in your body, so your body will know before your mind signs on.
The effects of this on practitioners, how do they differ from that in a more conventional focused meditation?
Well, what I would say is that one of the mistakes that grassroots movements make about their meditation practice is to think that one practice does everything. And, so I would say that classic meditation practices that give you a mantra and teach you single point focus are the classic gateway entry, because it teaches you to collect your attention so that your attention is not at the mercy of any random thought that comes in. Centering prayer teaches you surrender. And I think attention and surrender are basically the two joysticks that you use as a human being to navigate conscious transformation. And so centering prayer is fabulous on surrender. You learn this attitude of releasing, when in doubt, release at the subject pole, release the badging that you're clinging to. And it teaches you that. But it tends to be weak on attention, particularly at the beginning. Thomas Keating, who wrote, who basically was the architect of the method, said centering prayer is done not with attention, but with intention. And this is deceptive in a way because you can't really pay attention without intention, but in the insistence on letting go of objects of attention, uh, which comes right from the cloud of unknowing, incidentally, uh, he doesn't encourage that sharp-edged focus. And in order to realize you're thinking in the first place and you've gotten engaged with this thought, you really have to rely, particularly at the beginning, of the participation of your unconscious willingness to do the practice to remind you. So basically, at the beginning in centering prayer, a lot of time is spent in daydreaming. And what has been for me a weakness of the prayer in its first, its initial sort of first generational presentation, is that it allowed people to get away with the daydreaming because there wasn't enough concentration. There was too much theological story. Oh, we're in the hand of God. It's bliss, it's Jesus. And there wasn't enough, hey, folks, this is a very interesting experimental method. And what we're working on is to take away replace the story of yourself. Everybody wanted to go for their false self, which was their neurotic self, to their true self, which was their idealized, cleaned up version of themselves. And it was still all in story. They were pouring from empty to empty. And no one called the question on that for a long time. That this true self you're thinking you're perceiving is essentially a, a mirage, because the mechanism you currently have at this stage to allow you to move toward it is always going to trap you at a lower level than your true self is, because you're going to turn it into something with characteristics and features. And centering prayer, even though it had the mechanisms there to easily help people out of that trap, didn't for a long, long time. And it wasn't until the last 10 years or so of Thomas Keating's teachings, when he sort of went for broke and really just transposed the whole teaching onto a non-dual framework, that he could say these things more directly. So there was a lot of confusion about, that people thought that they were coming into centering prayer, letting go of their thoughts as the sort of toll booth you paid, and in return for that, receiving revelations about their unconscious that would give them a better bead on how to create their true self, which was very much envisioned as a new and improved version of themselves. And they didn't see that what they were doing was they were destroying the whole mechanism of consciousness that was going to trap them in that. So what I'm finding nowadays, frankly and very encouragingly, is that for the last 20 years of Thomas's very, very long life, he really pushed more directly in that direction. And a lot of his students who've been around for a long time already had the aptitude built into them because of the practice to do this. All they needed was a slightly wider frame. And I'm seeing really some astonishingly rapid and profound maturation among longtime students of the work as they follow Thomas toward his really, I think, brilliant and uh, and just exquisite efforts to move kenosis out of the domain of my individual will into the one of, you know something is being born in you that you couldn't even imagine what it was when you first started this practice, but now that it's there, let's just ride it. And you see this kind of joy that they realize, oh, it's right here, I can do this. How can I do this? It's not hard to let go of my early illusions of what my true self was, because this, what I am becoming, I dare not imagine. uh, I think that was a line from a Ruby poem. I died as a bedroll and went on to a vegetable, and then too I can pass. And the final line, and when I die to the angels, what I shall become, you cannot yet imagine. I mean, that nails it. And that's kind of what people are experiencing there when finally Thomas's late teaching catches up with this implicit lived experience base of them, which they didn't have the languaging to show them the treasure that was right there.
You've just mentioned Rumi, and we were going on to ask you.
Mm-hmm.
You talk in your work that you've learned from a number of traditions outside Christianity. Can you say something about what you've gleaned from other traditions, and are there any in particular that you'd like to mention?
Well, as I've said, that Christianity got hung up, kind of got detained uh, at what on the current maps of consciousness would be called the rational level of consciousness, which means that it's the kind of consciousness that posits as a center of itself an individual soul who's on a journey to a destiny that God will, and he got really trapped in that, in those essentially dualistic, beautiful but dualistic theological concepts. Uh, and so it did not grow a reliable, a Denny's appreciated integral wing. There have been, of course, many, many exceptions, but they got labeled as mystics, which meant basically weirdos and freaks, uh, and so in order to really sort of access and re-access Christianity's non-dual, intuition. And it's very, very helpful to have the brothering and sistering of traditions that have much more unabashedly developed these teachings. And for me, the most powerful of the two that have been brothers and sisters in that are Tibetan Buddhism and Sufism, uh, that both in their own ways attest to the reality of a whole different, richer, deeper reality beyond the rational constructs that Christianity seems to like swimming in. So Rumi is particularly brilliant. That Ken Wilber at one point in one of his better, the theorems, pointed out that that in every religious tradition there's a line, which is the whole developmental teaching itself, the whole theology, the whole shebang, and then there's the level, that at every level in an authorized, in a lineage religious tradition, people are practicing it and understanding it at various levels, different levels of consciousness, from the superstitious to the raw, right on up to the most sublimely non-dual. So the point is that Kinnaid and Thomas Keating exemplified beautifully that you are actually closer to people at your level on a different line of religion than you are to people on your line at a different level. And Christianity is seeing that in spades today when we look at, some of the superstitious and magical actings out of Christianity that are going on in the name of being Christian, really come right back to the tribal levels of consciousness. So Thomas Keating, back in the 1960s, when he became abbot of St. Joseph's Trappist Abbey, and so the monks were stuck and couldn't get out, and they'd given their lives to come to be mystics in a contemplative monastery, but they couldn't. It was just boring. He started bringing in people to help them. And he relied very, very heavily on a Zen Buddhist Roshi. He brought in some Hindus. He got they taught the whole monastery TM. Just Thomas unabashedly outsourced the teaching that Christianity actually had, but had become inaccessible by inviting the religions that had better curated this level of their own line to come and help us find ours. And that's been That's been great. I mean, the Rumi is one of the most classically read texts in our Christian wisdom circles because he gets it. He absolutely gets it, and in some ways, Hafiz is even more splendid because he never loses that kind of ironic edge to his teaching. I mean, he's just so hilarious. It is, you have not danced too badly, my fallen angel. You know, he just says things that are not sweet and yet get to the point so gorgeously. And I've watched my Christian brothers and sisters wake up. Rumi's The Guest House really is a wonderful. It should be in every book on centering prayer because it says welcome them all. Don't push them away. Don't some guests are going to come into your life. You're going to have a soul that's filled with everything, and your emotional life is going to have all these kind of people knocking on your door. So uh might as well learn that deep attitude of welcoming, which is another variation on the theme of surrender. Rather than pushing it away, you open to it. And as you do that, you put yourself back into that mind that is really the transformational, that is the gateway into that other level of consciousness and selfhood.
You mentioned Gebser and Wilbur and others, and in some of your more recent blogs, you've written extensively about the current world situation and using their ideas as a lens with which to look at what is going on and how we might understand the quandaries of modernity and how this idea of the integral in a way is pulling us towards a more holistic and a more complete human unfolding and integration. So how what would you like to say about that? I really do appreciate the fact that you are so easily willing to bring in these different lenses and different perspectives from other traditions and other thinkers. And I think this is extremely valuable. And so, how should we understand the idea of the integral? And what does it say about the development of humanity as a whole?
Yeah, well, I would start by saying, as I applied these lenses in the first place, is because I think a lot of the intellectual tradition, like all of the intellectual tradition that I've seen in my own country, is basically stuck in a historical frame of reference, which is far too narrow. You know, it goes back 250 years to the founding of the country, maybe 500 years at best to the Renaissance, but it doesn't get these deeper movements of currents. And the two that I brought in my blog were the Gebserian one, which is basically based on structures of consciousness, and the other one was the Teilhardian, which is evolution ever since the planet Earth appeared 4.5 billion years ago. And basically, they have in common, take a longer look. The arc is longer. Don't get all fussed out about what's happening within a 50-year slice. So, of the various maps that I've used, the one that has been most enduringly helpful to me is the evolution of consciousness model. But I very, very much like the Gebserian model quantitatively better than any of the modern sort of hybrids that have emerged out of it, uh, because it's very grounded and lucid. Uh, and many of the models that have come out today have been developmental models, onward and upward, and we're on this new stage. The integral model basically says that the reason that we're having all this turmoil is, because we're basically stuck in a very, very difficult birth canal between the waning of one structure, the old rational structure, or the middle structure, as Gebser calls it, which has dominated thinking uh, for and dominated cultural and set the cosmovision and the norms for at least 2,500 years, right back to in the West, the ancient Greeks, uh, set a certain dialectical, philosophical, quantitative, mensural and measurable way of looking at the world that's dominated the way we think about things. And this is giving way to this integral level, which for Gebser, very interestingly, was not onwards and upwards, but downward. It was increasing a capaciousness that didn't just sort of replace the earlier structures of consciousness with something new and more sparkly, like replacing your automobile, but allowed you to hold each of them and thus the whole human journey, collective evolution of consciousness in your own being from a deeper, more integrated place. What Gurdjieff, another of my favorites, would call three-centered awareness. So it really is not just a new level of consciousness so much as a deepening capacity to stay in, to consciously be able to feel each one of them as they bear on you like oak trees in a forest, without collapsing, and bringing to something of a quality of heart to it. Gebser also, rather than putting the map on on staircase, which is a classic Western developmental habit, he puts it as a circle floating around a center, and the center is origin. And what he says is origin is present. As a matter of fact, the title of his groundbreaking book was The Ever-Present Origin, and that origin is that ever creative, mysterious, interactive in a kind of way, and strangely intimate and accessible presence of cosmogonic reality. And it's there, but it basically has extended itself outward into created form in the shape of these structures of consciousness, which are collective structures that allow whole sort of civilizations to perceive how this origin is acting and to be in relationship with it. So the really good news is that absolutely confirms everything that mystics have been saying from the get-go. The divine is right here and directly perceptible and directly fulfillable. My teacher, Thomas Keating, said about that really beautifully. He says that the world we picture with our usual mind isn't real because an important dimension is missing. He says it's the fourth dimension that sees the divine entering and leaving with every nanosecond, that to be able to actually perceive that we are in a creative cosmogenesis right now. And so in other words, what's happening then is that what we're seeing, according to this interpretive map, is the struggle to the death, as it were, between a structure of consciousness that's really based in finitude, in things having physical, phenomenal reality, and in individuals and a society as a collection, an aggregation of individual bits, rather than the other consciousness that grasps relationality directly and sees the individual bits as part of a moving kaleidoscope of a whole process that it can grasp when these other faculties kick in you, but it doesn't grasp it as a thought. It grasps it like knowing what the next step is in the tango. So that allows us to see, and that rather than, as an American, rather than this, driving myself to distraction by what looks like the grotesque, upending of structures of consciousness and civilization and polite discourse and that have been around for 2,500 years, you realize that this is painful but completely consistent with symbols of the disintegration that happens when an old structure of consciousness is losing force. But I think that what sets my own response off from so many people, I mean, every once in a while you go on a New Age magazine and somebody will be emoting about a cosmic convergence or a peace and harmony, and it's all assumed that this new consciousness, because it's all about oneness, is going to be sweetness and light, and no. Absolutely not. That's the simplest thing, the simplest theological mistake is to try and arrive at light by eliminating darkness. I mean, until you until you can grasp the whole polarity and allow it to sting you in your being and to transform it with your tears, uh, you're not going to you're not going to see. And these artificial ersatz kingdoms where everybody comes together and drinks kombucha and smiles and chants and says, "Ain't love great?" is not what it's going to be about. And so I've found that all this breathy talk about the new age, of the great cosmic breakthrough is basically more of a hindrance than a help. You know, what I want is people that can stand there and weep like the Pietà and hold in their hands the terrific cost at which anything has been gotten, beginning in creation itself. And from there, with not all these, happy little joys like it's a wedding celebration or something, but with a deeper sort of sobriety that we're moving into revelations that the capacity for joy uh, is probably counterbalanced almost directly by our capacity to bear pain without judgment and without, retraction.
That's wonderful. Yes, and I think you've answered some really interesting questions about how the developmental model, the staircase model, in a way is kind of a dualistic model. That somehow consciousness grows out of nothing to something, whereas this notion of the ever-present origin is that the oneness, the integral, is already here now.
Yeah.
There always has been, and what happens is that it unfolds. It doesn't evolve, so to speak. It unfolds.
Exactly. That's a beautiful distinction in language.
I think maybe we have time, if you don't mind, Cynthia, for one more question.
Yeah, Cynthia, we wanted to ask you a bit about Mary Magdalene, which is, something you've written a lot about, and particularly rehabilitating her, as you discovered in the Gospels of Thomas and Mary, she becomes Jesus' closest companion.
Yeah.
And grasps his teaching in a way that the other disciples don't manage to. In fact, sometimes you could think of her as an apostle to the apostles.
Yeah.
And that really, the way you present her is that she represents a path of transformative embodied love, which she actually lives in her life, which has subsequently been suppressed. And so she's much more than just a reclaiming of a feminine dimension to Christianity, because in a way you could say she exemplifies what a true follower of Jesus might look like. So could you just say a bit more about her and what we can learn from her?
Well, I think that one of the things that we can learn is how badly distorted are our maps that try to understand, Jesus and Jesus's teaching. She's very much a bellwether to Jesus's teaching, because if you get the nature of their relationship, you got a lot of the rest of it, and what what seems to be the case, particularly as we look at the Gospel of Thomas and its presentation, and certainly the Gospel of Mary, which is another of these, is that she could follow his integral flow. I mean, she matched him. She understood what he was doing. She saw what he saw. She saw how it became possible that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Because she saw the wholeness of it. It's, she was looking from the transformed state of consciousness. And but society has gotten used to looking at her from the state of consciousness that we're in, and it gives us a variety of models that don't fit, because a lower model can't perceive a higher one. Is she a whore? Was she his lover? Is the church trying to cover up this? Was she the divine feminine goddess come to earth? I mean, we have all these data models that and they're all crazy, and what they do is they still separate love. Well, they could be, well, Jesus, okay, we'll let him have a girlfriend, but God forbid that they should be physically intimate, and I'm not saying they were. I'm saying it's irrelevant, because Jesus was teaching a path of radical kenosis, not radical celibacy, and that, we know perfectly well that radical kenosis is practiced by couples as well as, and often more often than, by celibates, because where two are gathered together, irritation is in their midst. So it's this constant kind of polishing and learning to defer, and he's saying, let love rejoin, let love be love, and let the beautiful cosmic creativity and desiring and yearning that's the turf of eros, and the utterly pure self-surrender that's the turf of kenosis, dance together and form the yin and yang of a consciousness that can actually pick something up, that love is whole, people are whole, and the portrait of Mary Magdalene. So I've tried to keep her sober and lucid. I don't let her become a goddess. I think that whole sort of Jungian tangent of projecting archetypal qualities on real historical people is a little bit self-indulgent. I think this is a real person who got what he was doing, who understood the transformation of consciousness, and the people around her just didn't get what was happening and was threatened by it, not because they were having sex, but because they were modeling together a level of consciousness which was not understood and which was deeply feared by the church, and is still deeply feared, because if this level of consciousness should actually kick in, all the old institutional structure is going to have to be revisioned from the ground up, no longer as a system of control and metering, but as a system of creative midwifing.
So, Cynthia, you've taken us on a really interesting journey from peak to peak, kind of a world tour of many wonderful ideas. Now, as you know, our listeners and readers on the Bishara magazine have much in common and much overlap with your ideas and your work. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with us, or anything we haven't asked you that you'd like to convey?
Well, only my deep appreciation to the producers of Bishara magazine and the whole conscious and transformational spiritual nexus that supports it. That you guys are players, real players in a world where honest transformative truth, packaged in love and conscience, is still of value. So just keep on doing what you're doing, and I'm honored to have been able to spend time with such wise and mature human beings.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Cynthia, and thank you again for your time. We really appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Cynthia Bourgeault's many books are widely available, and her most recent is Thomas Keating, The Making of a Modern Christian Mystic, published in late 2024. She also runs online retreats, which can be accessed through her website. Subscribe to Bishara Magazine podcasts on Apple, Spotify, or any of your favorite listening platforms. And in addition to podcasts, there are hundreds of articles on our website, www.bisharamagazine.org.